Valley of the Beast by Algernon Blackwood. 1. As they emerged suddenly from the dense forest, the Indian halted, and Grimwood, his employer, stood beside him, gazing into the beautiful wooded valley that lay spread below them in the blaze of a golden sunset. Both men leaned upon their rifles, caught by the enchantment of the unexpected scene.
"We camp here,"
said Tushali abruptly after a careful survey.
"Tomorrow we make a plan."
He spoke excellent English. The note of decision, almost of authority in his voice, was noticeable, but Grimwood set it down to the natural excitement of the moment. Every track they had followed during the last 2 days, but one track in particular as well, had headed straight for this remote and hidden valley, and the sport promised to be unusual.
"That's so," he replied in the tone of one giving an order. "You can make camp ready at once."
And he sat down on a fallen hemlock to take off his moccasin boots and grease his feet that ached from the arduous day now drawing to a close. Though under ordinary circumstances he would have pushed on for another hour or two, he was not averse to a night here, for exhaustion had come upon him during the last bit of rough going. His eye and muscles were no longer steady, and it was doubtful if he could have shot straight enough to kill. He did not mean to miss a second time. With his Canadian friend Iredale, the latter's half-breed, and his own Indian, Tushali, the party had set out 3 weeks ago to find the wonderful big moose the Indians reported were traveling in the Snow River country. They soon found that the tale was true. Tracks were abundant. They saw fine animals nearly every day, but though carrying good heads, the hunters expected better still and left them alone. Pushing up the river to a small chain of lakes near its source, they then separated into 2 parties, each with its 9-foot bark canoe, and packed in for 3 days after the yet bigger animals the Indians agreed would be found in the deeper woods beyond. Excitement was keen, expectation keener still. The day before they separated, Iredale shot the biggest moose of his life, and its head, bigger even than the grand Alaskan heads, hangs in his house today. Grimwood's hunting blood was fairly up. His blood was of the fiery, not to say ferocious, quality. It almost seemed he liked killing for its own sake. 4 days after the party broke into 2, he came upon a gigantic track, whose measurements and length of stride keyed every nerve he possessed to its highest tension. Tushali examined the tracks for some minutes with care.
"It is the biggest moose in the world,"
he said at length, a new expression on his inscrutable red visage. Following it all that day, they yet got no sight of the big fellow that seemed to be frequenting a little marshy dip of country, too small to be called valley, where willow and undergrowth abounded. He had not yet scented his pursuers. They were after him again at dawn. Toward the evening of the second day, Grimwood caught a sudden glimpse of the monster among a thick clump of willows, and the sight of the magnificent head that easily beat all records set his heart beating like a hammer with excitement. He aimed and fired, but the moose, instead of crashing, went thundering away through the farther scrub and disappeared, the sound of his plunging canter presently dying away. Grimwood had missed, even if he had wounded. They camped, and all next day, leaving the canoe behind, they followed the huge track. But though finding signs of blood, these were not plentiful, and the shot had evidently only grazed the animal. The traveling was of the hardest. Toward evening, utterly exhausted, the spoor led them to the ridge they now stood upon, gazing down into the enchanting valley that opened at their feet. The giant moose had gone down into this valley. He would consider himself safe there. Grimwood agreed with the Indian's judgment. They would camp for the night and continue at dawn the wild hunt after the biggest moose in the world. Supper was over, the small fire used for cooking dying down, when Grimwood became first aware that the Indian was not behaving quite as usual. What particular detail drew his attention is hard to say. He was a slow-witted, heavy man, full-blooded, unobservant. A fact had to hurt him through his comfort, through his pleasure before he noticed it. Yet anyone else must have observed the changed mood of the redskin long ago. Tushali had made the fire, fried the bacon, served the tea, and was arranging the blankets, his own and his employer's, before the latter remarked upon his silence. Tushali had not uttered a word for over an hour and a half, since he had first set eyes upon the new valley, to be exact. And his employer now noticed the unaccustomed silence because after food he liked to listen to wood talk and hunting lore.
Tired out, aren't you?
Said Big Grimwood, looking into the dark face across the firelight. He resented the absence of conversation now that he noticed it. He was overweary himself. He felt more irritable than usual, though his temper was always vile.
Lost your tongue, eh?
He went on with a growl as the Indian returned his stare with solemn, expressionless face. That dark, inscrutable look got on his nerves a bit.
Speak up, man, he exclaimed sharply. What's it all about?
The Englishman had at last realized that there was something to speak up about. The discovery, in his present state, annoyed him further. Tushali stared gravely, but made no reply. The silence was prolonged almost into minutes. Presently the head turned sideways, as though the man listened. The other watched him very closely, anger growing in him. But it was the way the redskin turned his head, keeping his body rigid, that gave the jerk to Grimwood's nerves, providing him with a sensation he had never known in his life before. It gave him what is generally called the goose flesh. It seemed to jangle his entire system, yet at the same time made him cautious. He did not like it. This combination of emotions puzzled him.
Say something, I tell you,
he repeated in a harsher tone, raising his voice. He sat up, drawing his great body closer to the fire.
Say something, damn it!
His voice fell dead against the surrounding trees, making the silence of the forest unpleasantly noticeable. Very still the great woods stood about them. There was no wind, no stir of branches. Only the crackle of a snapping twig was audible from time to time, as the nightlife moved unwarily sometimes, watching the humans round their little fire. The October air had a frosty touch that nipped. The redskin did not answer. No muscle of his neck nor of his stiffened body moved. He seemed all ears.
Well?
Repeated the Englishman, lowering his voice this time instinctively.
What do you hear, goddammit?
The touch of odd nervousness that made his anger grow betrayed itself in his language. Tushali slowly turned his head back again to its normal position, the body rigid as before.
I hear nothing, Mr. Grimwood,
he said, gazing with quiet dignity into his employer's eyes. This was too much for the other, a man of savage temper at the best of times. He was the type of Englishman who held strong views as to the right way of treating inferior races.
That's a lie, Tushali, and I won't have you lie to me. Now what was it? Tell me at once.
I hear nothing, repeated the other. I only think.
And what is it you're pleased to think?
Impatience made a nasty expression round the mouth.
I go not,
was the abrupt reply, unalterable decision in the voice. The man's rejoinder was so unexpected that Grimwood found nothing to say at first. For a moment he did not take its meaning. His mind, always slow, was confused by impatience, also by what he considered the foolishness of the little scene. Then, in a flash, he understood. But he also understood the immovable obstinacy of the race he had to deal with. Tushali was informing him that he refused to go into the valley where the big moose had vanished, and his astonishment was so great at first that he merely sat and stared. No words came to him.
It is,
said the Indian, but used a native term.
What's that mean?
Grimwood found his tongue, but his quiet tone was ominous.
Mr. Grimwood, it means the Valley of the Beast,
was the reply in a tone quieter still. The Englishman made a genuine effort at self-control. He was dealing, he forced himself to remember, with a superstitious redskin. He knew the stubbornness of the type. If the man left him, his sport was irretrievably spoiled, for he could not hunt in this wilderness alone, and even if he got the coveted head, he could never get it out alone. His native selfishness seconded his effort. Persuasion, if only he could keep back his rising anger, was his role to play.
The Valley of the Beast,
he said, a smile on his lips rather than in his darkening eyes.
But that's just what we want. It's Beast we're after, isn't it?
His voice had a false, cheery ring that could not have deceived a child.
But what you mean, anyhow, the Valley of the Beast?
He asked it with a dull attempt at sympathy.
It belonged to Ishtot, Mr. Grimwood.
The man looked him full in the face, no flinching in the eyes.
Our big moose is there,
said the other, who recognized the name of the Indian hunting god, and understanding better, felt confident he would soon persuade his man. Tushali, he remembered too, was nominally a Christian.
We'll follow him at dawn and get the biggest head the world has ever seen. You will be famous, he added,
his temper better and in hand again.
Your tribe will honor you, and the white hunters will pay you much money.
He go there to save himself. I go not. The other's anger revived with a leap at this stupid obstinacy. But, in spite of it, he noticed the odd choice of words. He began to realize that nothing now would move the man. At the same time, he also realized that violence on his part must prove worse than useless. Yet violence was natural to his dominant type.
That brute Grimwood,
was the way most men spoke of him.
Back at the settlement, you're a Christian, remember?
He tried, in his clumsy way, another line.
And disobedience means hellfire. You know that.
I, a Christian. At the post, was the reply.
But out here, the Red God rule. Ishtot keep that valley for himself. No Indian hunt there.
It was as though a granite boulder spoke. The savage temper of the Englishman, enforced by the long, difficult suppression, rose wickedly into sudden flame. He stood up, kicking his blankets aside. He strode across the dying fire to the Indian side. Tushali also rose. They faced each other, two humans alone in the wilderness, watched by countless invisible forest eyes. Tushali stood motionless, yet as though he expected violence from the foolish, ignorant white face.
You go alone, Mr. Grimwood.
There was no fear in him. Grimwood choked with rage. His words came forth with difficulty, though he roared them into the silence of the forest.
I pay you, don't I? You do what I say, not what you say.
His voice woke the echoes. The Indian, arms hanging by his side, gave the old reply.
I go not,
he repeated firmly. It stung the other into uncontrollable fury. The beast then came uppermost. It came out.
You said that once too often, Tushali,
and he struck him brutally in the face. The Indian fell, rose to his knees again, collapsed sideways beside the fire, then struggled back into a sitting position. He never once took his eyes from the white man's face. Beside himself with anger, Grimwood stood over him.
Is that enough? Will you obey me now?
He shouted.
I go not,
came the thick reply, blood streaming from his mouth. The eyes had no flinching in them.